Hey there, y'all, and welcome back to Booked with the Cook. So, for this time, I got a request to do a special episode in celebration of Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And I thought, why not do one of my favorite desserts in honor of it? Dango. Dango is a typically sweet, but not always, Japanese rice dumpling that has a variety of toppings and can come in a wide range of colors and flavors. It also happens to be part of a wider category of Japanese sweets called wagashi, and are usually enjoyed with green tea. And I'm just gonna go ahead and say it here right now, I apologize for every single Japanese word I'm about to butcher for y'all today. I'll show you a very basic recipe for dango as well as my favorite topping for these delightfully delectable little dumplings. Now, there is a long list of Asian cooking channels here on YouTube, and I'll have a few of those linked in the description down below. I'll also be including the 2 websites where you can find recipes that inspired this one as well. And remember, these are hardly the only YouTube channels that have Asian American, or Pacific Islander creators, so if you have some you'd like to suggest for others, please leave them in the comment section. Especially if you're eager to share or learn more about the hundreds of food cultures these terms represent. All that being said, if you're not already familiar with Japanese ingredients, there might be a bit of a learning curve associated with getting started, even with simple dishes. But worry not, dear patrons, for you have a certified weeaboo on staff at the Winter Park Library, and I'm happy to give y'all a crash course on the fun world of Japanese ingredients. For the dumplings themselves, you'll need only 3 things: rice flour, tofu, and water. Now, the simplicity of this list is deceiving because not just any rice flour or tofu will do, and some rice flours are actually pretty difficult to get a hold of here in the US. Just like with baked goods made with wheat flour, sometimes you need a certain type to achieve a specific effect. The 2 types of rice flour I'll be using today are called mochiko and shiratamako. Both of these fall into a category of rice flours made with quote-unquote glutinous rice. These can also be referred to as sweet rice flours on their packaging because of the type of rice used to make them. Glutinous doesn't necessarily refer to gluten like wheat gluten, but rather the very sticky or gooey consistency this type of rice has when it's exposed to moisture. But even still, textures between glutinous rice flour types can be very different. The primary rice flour we'll be using in this recipe, the shiratamako, is lumpy and almost pearl-like, while the mochiko is very powdery and fine. Like I said, since we're going to be using mostly the shiratamako for this recipe, we're going to hold this little bit of mochiko in reserve just in case we need it. Next is the tofu, and if you're raising an eyebrow at the idea of using tofu in a dessert, stop it. Tofu has virtually no flavor on its own and therefore makes for an excellent addition to all kinds of dishes, including sweets. It's especially useful in this dish as a binder and as a way of locking moisture into our little dumplings so they don't get dry later. For this recipe, you must use silken tofu. There are 3 types of tofu available to me at my local grocery store: firm, extra firm, and silken. These are pretty different from each other and are used in wildly different ways. Silken tofu is the softest of all the types and tends to get used in soups or as a binder in recipes like this one. Firm and extra firm, on the other hand, hold together far more easily and tend to get used in fried dishes. Don't use these types for this. Seriously, it won't work out well for you, trust me. Okay, now that we've got that explanation out of the way, let's get to cooking. First, toss some small wood skewers into a little container of water. This seems weird, but trust me, it is going to help later. Next, I'm going to use my scale to measure out 150 grams of shiratamako flour, and then do the same for 150 grams of tofu. If you don't have a scale, not a problem. This translates very roughly to a half a cup plus 7 tablespoons of the shiratamako and 3/4 cup of the tofu, but you'll have slightly more than if you were weighing it out. This isn't a huge issue, you'll just have slightly more dango, which is never a bad thing. Now we can start to blend the 2 together. You can do this with a spoon or your hand, either way, just get in there and start squishing. It'll start off as somewhat of a shaggy mess, but it should eventually start to come together. If it's not quite coming together or is remaining crumbly, just sprinkle in a bit of lukewarm tap water. Once it really starts coming together, actually dip your hand in the water and start kneading the dough. The moisture from the tofu and your water will hydrate the rice flour and it'll start to stiffen. And if you get it too wet like I did here, Get out your mochiko and just sprinkle a little in. Just keep working with it until this dough is very smooth and glossy. Some folks say it should feel like an earlobe, but really it should be very dense and feel like very soft Play-Doh. Once it looks like this and your bowl is relatively clean, you're ready for the next step. Speaking of Play-Doh, I want you to dip deep into the back of your brain and pull out that inner child, because we're going full preschool on this stuff. Roll your little log thing into a Play-Doh snake, and you're going to separate them out into evenly sized little lumps. I'm weighing them out to be about 15 grams each, but you can always use a tablespoon to measure these too. I'm also using a bench scraper for this, but you can always use a knife or just tear them off, it's easy. Now you're going to roll each into a round little ball. FYI, this is a great recipe to do with kids, so get them in on the fun too. Now we're going to cook these little guys. Get out a relatively big pot and bring a good amount of water to a boil. Drop in your dango quickly but gently. You want all of these guys to finish cooking roughly at the same time. Once they're in your pot, make sure you scoot them around. You do not want them sticking to the bottom or to each other. Now, if you've ever cooked anything like gnocchi or tortellini before, you're about to see something familiar because dango pop up out of the water just like those do. However, unlike those other two, these aren't done yet. Let them cook for 2 to 3 minutes more once they've popped up out of the water. FYI, if you used my suggested US measurements and wound up with slightly bigger dumplings, let those go closer to the 3-minute mark. Once those are done, pull them out of your pot and immediately pop them into an ice water bath. You don't want these overcooking because they'll get doughy and fall apart. Once they are just cooled to room temperature, pull them out onto a little tray or dish and set them to the side. And if you remember back to the beginning of the video, I said that these are a type of sweet, and so far, there has been no sugar. Well, that comes next. What we just made was a basic unflavored dango. Now, you can add sugar to these so they can be totally sweet on their own. As a matter of fact, the very popular hanami dango are sweetened this way. They're eaten during hanami or the sakura viewing celebrations and festivals of early spring, which are usually held in April. But the ones we're making today are called miritashi dango and are enjoyed all year round. After they're boiled, these are then grilled and then coated in a sweetened soy sauce, and I'll show you how I like to make mine. The ingredients you'll need for the sauce are 4 tablespoons of sugar, 2 tablespoons of mirin, which is a sweetened rice wine very common in Japanese cooking, 150 milliliters or a little over a half a cup of water, 2 tablespoons of soy sauce, and finally 2 tablespoons of cornstarch or potato starch, which is known in Japanese as katakuriko. Now the potato starch is more traditional, but it's just being used as a thickener here, so there's no reason not to use cornstarch if that's what you have on hand. The sauce is really easy. Just dump all of your liquid ingredients into a small sauce pot, but don't turn on the heat just yet. Get those blended together and make sure your starch is as incorporated as possible, and then turn the heat on to medium. Keep whisking or stirring this stuff until it starts to thicken up a little bit. Get it about as half as thick as you want the final product to be, and then take it off the heat to cool. Don't worry, it will thicken as it cools down. And be prepared to pull this stuff as soon as it's the consistency you want it. The thickening action can sneak up on you. But if you get it a little too thick, not to worry, just water it down with a little bit of mirin, soy sauce, and water, and it should turn out just fine. Also, small note here, if you're using potato starch like I am, then your sauce will be a little bit on the cloudy side. If you're wanting a clearer sauce, use cornstarch instead. Now while you're waiting for that to cool down, take your skewers out of the water and stick 3 of your dango onto each skewer. The reason we soak the skewers is that if we left them dry, they would have actually torn up our dumplings as we push them onto the skewer, and we kind of need these guys as intact as possible for the next step. Now, miritashi dango can be eaten just like this with the sauce over the boiled dumplings, but they're also often grilled or charred as well, and I'll show you guys how to do that. So for a few of these, I'm going to take and fry the dango skewer on each side until they're this nice golden brown color. Once they're as grilled as you want, pour over the sauce, make you some tea, and finally, enjoy! This really is a simple little sweet and a fun way to get introduced to the wonderful world of Japanese wagashi. If y'all would like me to do other recipes from Japan, just let me know and I'll give it my best shot. Hope y'all enjoyed the video, and happy Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, y'all! Take care!